Marcus Kane in Chicago and Liam Hawke in London were just teenagers when the streets taught them that fear was power and loyalty could be bought. Decades later, their names would strike terror across two continents, as empires built in shadows challenged law, rivals, and anyone who dared stand in their way. This is the story of two of the world's most ruthless gangsters and the minds that made them untouchable. In the grim streets of Chicago and the rough neighborhoods of London, life was unforgiving. The concrete jungles were littered with abandoned buildings, graffiti-stained walls, and streets that seemed to swallow hope whole. In these places, poverty wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a teacher. It forced children to grow up fast, to learn early that weakness could mean defeat, and that survival often required bending or breaking rules that others followed blindly. One such child roamed the alleys of Chicago, his small frame hiding a mind that observed everything. He watched adults with envy and caution, noting who commanded respect, who bent under pressure, and who disappeared without warning. He learned that fear could be used as a weapon, and that a single well-timed action could turn the balance of power in his favor. Half a world away, in a densely packed London borough, another boy was discovering similar lessons in a different language and culture. His streets were narrow, filled with the echoes of sirens, barking dogs, and the harsh shouts of rival gangs marking their territory. He learned early that words alone were not enough to protect someone. Intelligence, patience, and the ability to manipulate situations could accomplish what violence sometimes could not. While others relied on brute force, he observed, planned, and tested the limits of those around him. By the time he reached his teenage years, he had learned to read people like open books, noticing patterns, fears, and opportunities. Both boys came from broken homes where survival was a daily challenge. Families struggled to make ends meet, and the law was often absent where it was needed most. For them, schools offered little beyond a brief respite from the chaos outside. Education came in a different form on the streets, where lessons were harsh, unforgiving, and immediate. They learned early that loyalty could be bought or broken, that trust was fragile, and that every decision carried consequences far beyond their understanding at the time. By the age of 12, both had committed their first small crimes. They were insignificant to the authorities, almost invisible, yet monumental in the shaping of their futures. Each minor theft or con was carefully planned, executed, and analyzed afterward, teaching them lessons about risk, reward, and human behavior. They discovered the thrill of control, of influencing the world around them without being controlled themselves. Their environments had hardened them, sharpened their instincts, and ignited a hunger for more than just survival. As the years passed, the boys began to notice the hierarchies that governed their streets. Older teens and adults ran small operations, from petty thefts to drug dealing, and each had a network of enforcers and informants. Observing these structures, the boys realized that the world didn't reward fairness or kindness. It rewarded cunning, courage, and the ability to instill fear when necessary. By their late teens, they had both stepped into the underworld in more significant ways, gaining allies, recruiting followers, and asserting influence in their neighborhoods. Their reputations grew quietly but rapidly. Whispers of their names began circulating, and even the toughest local figures started to take notice. Though separated by oceans, these two young men were connected by circumstance, upbringing, and an unyielding drive for power. The seeds of ambition, ruthlessness, and strategic thinking planted in these early years would soon grow into full-blown criminal empires. They were no longer just children of poverty. They were predators in the making, destined to leave a mark on both sides of the Atlantic that few would forget. By the time they reached their late teens, both young gangsters had moved beyond survival. The streets had become classrooms, and every encounter offered a lesson in strategy, human behavior, and the harsh rules of the underworld. In Chicago, the young man watched how local crews operated, noticing the small but crucial details that others overlooked. He observed how alliances formed and dissolved, how loyalty was tested, and how quickly betrayal could turn friends into enemies. Every minor skirmish, every argument over territory or money, became a case study in power and influence. He learned that strength alone could only take a person so far. To dominate, one needed patience, intelligence, and an instinct for timing that most people never developed. Across the Atlantic, in London, the other boy studied similar patterns, though his environment required a different approach. The streets were tight-knit, every corner a potential trap, and every stranger a possible threat. He learned to read gestures, expressions, and subtle cues that revealed intentions before actions occurred. He discovered that the law could be manipulated as easily as any rival, and that perception often mattered more than reality. A well-placed rumor, a calculated threat, or even a carefully staged fight could shift the balance of power without a single life being lost. He understood that fear, respect, and perception were tools that could be wielded with deadly precision. Both gangsters quickly realized that true power did not come from brute force alone. They needed to understand the people around them, their friends, their enemies, and those caught in between. They learned to test loyalty, to probe weaknesses, and to identify individuals who could be useful in the future. Observation became a weapon, and every conversation, every deal, and every glance carried significance. Even small mistakes by others were opportunities to gain advantage, to assert dominance, or to gather information. They were no longer just part of the criminal world. They were architects of it, slowly constructing networks that were invisible to outsiders, but highly efficient for those who knew the rules. During this period, both began experimenting with methods that set them apart. The Chicago gangster tested schemes that combined multiple criminal activities into one operation, reducing risk and increasing profit. He discovered that controlling key point supply routes, communication channels, and trusted enforcers allowed him to expand influence without attracting immediate attention from law enforcement. In London, the young man relied on a more subtle approach, blending intimidation with manipulation. He created a network of informants, carefully choosing who would deliver information and who would enforce decisions, ensuring that every move was calculated to minimize exposure while maximizing control. By their early 20s, both had built small but formidable reputations. Their names were whispered in fear, respected in caution, and often mispronounced by those too intimidated to speak directly. They had learned the value of patience, the power of calculated risk, and the subtle art of psychological warfare. They had discovered that criminal empires were not built overnight. They required understanding, strategy, and an unyielding commitment to survival and dominance. The lessons learned during these years would define their futures. They were no longer mere participants in the criminal world. They were strategists, thinkers, and tacticians. Every theft, every con, and every carefully orchestrated act was a step toward something larger, something far more dangerous. By mastering the rules of the game, they had prepared themselves not just to survive, but to rise, leaving the streets that had raised them forever changed and paving the way for the empires they were destined to create. By their early 20s, the two gangsters had moved beyond observation and experimentation. They were beginning to taste real power. In Chicago, the young man's influence extended across several neighborhoods. Small-time hustlers had become loyal lieutenants, and petty criminal operations had been transformed into structured networks that generated significant revenue. Gambling dens, underground bars, and illicit drug trades all fell under his growing control. But what set him apart was not just the size of his operations. It was the meticulous way he managed them. Each move was calculated, each alliance weighed, and each threat neutralized before it had a chance to grow. The streets knew him, but few understood the mind behind his actions. In London, the other young gangster had followed a similar trajectory, though his methods differed. Instead of relying on visible dominance, he operated in the shadows, building extortion rings, smuggling operations, and covert distribution channels that left little evidence behind. His control was subtle but absolute. Local businesses paid for protection. Rival gangs were systematically weakened, and anyone who dared challenge his authority quickly learned that resistance carried a steep cost. His reputation grew quietly but powerfully, spreading through whispers, warnings, and the occasional brutal demonstration of control. People feared what they could not see, and he ensured that fear worked in his favor. The rise to power was not without obstacles. Both faced rival gangs, law enforcement scrutiny, and the constant threat of betrayal. In Chicago, a rival crew attempted to encroach on his territory, sparking a violent confrontation that tested his leadership. He responded with precision, neutralizing the threat while minimizing collateral damage, demonstrating that he was both ruthless and strategic. In London, a rival alliance tried to undermine his operations by spreading false rumors and targeting his network of informants. He dismantled their efforts methodically, using manipulation and selective intimidation to regain control, leaving his rivals demoralized and disoriented. Each challenge reinforced their understanding that power was never absolute, and that maintaining it required constant vigilance. Both gangsters had also discovered the psychological aspects of leadership. Fear was a tool, but so was loyalty. They learned to reward those who followed them faithfully, creating networks that were motivated by both intimidation and incentive. Trust was a calculated risk, and betrayal was met with consequences so severe that it served as a warning to others. In this way, they managed to maintain control over increasingly complex operations while keeping potential threats at bay. As their empires grew, so did their ambition. The Chicago gangster began eyeing connections beyond his city, seeking opportunities that could expand his influence nationally and internationally. The London gangster, similarly, explored networks that could stretch his reach across Europe. Both recognized that power was not simply about dominating a street corner or a neighborhood. It was about creating a system in which others acted on their behalf, extending their influence without exposing themselves unnecessarily. By the end of their third decade, each had solidified a foundation that few could challenge. Their names were no longer whispered with curiosity. They were spoken with caution, awe, and fear. They had moved from the streets of their youth into the realm of leaders, tacticians, and strategists, fully aware that the world they were building was one that could endure long after their immediate actions faded from memory. The taste of power had awakened a hunger that would drive their next moves, setting the stage for a dangerous and unstoppable rise that would bridge the criminal worlds of America and the UK. As their empires expanded, the two gangsters began to push boundaries that went far beyond their home territories. In Chicago, the young man's network had become a citywide machine, but ambition drove him further. He sought alliances with other American criminal organizations, carefully studying their operations and identifying weaknesses to exploit. Smuggling routes, financial channels, and corrupt officials became pieces in a larger game that he controlled from behind the scenes. He rarely appeared in public, but his presence was felt everywhere. Each shipment that arrived, each deal that closed, and each rival that fell confirmed his growing power. He was no longer simply a local player. He was becoming a force with influence that could stretch beyond state lines. Across the Atlantic, the London gangster had begun to mirror this expansion in his own way. His operations, once confined to narrow boroughs, now reached into other parts of the UK. Smuggling operations stretched from the docks to remote villages. Extortion networks infiltrated new businesses, and street crews became specialized teams carrying out carefully orchestrated tasks. He had learned that subtlety often outweighed brute force, and by remaining unseen, he kept both rivals and authorities guessing. Small, targeted strikes against competitors created fear without exposing him. Allowing him to consolidate control while avoiding unnecessary attention was inevitable that their paths would align in unexpected ways. A single shipment of narcotics traveling from Europe to the United States disappeared without a trace, sparking suspicion across both continents. Neither gangster knew of the other at first, but their operations began to intersect, and intelligence gathered by both sides hinted at another powerful presence operating in parallel. Each responded cautiously, treating the unknown force as both a threat and a potential opportunity. This invisible chess game forced them to anticipate moves that spanned thousands of miles, creating tension that neither had faced before. Both leaders began to understand that global influence required more than local domination. The Chicago gangster refined his network of contacts, using trusted lieutenants to manage foreign connections while maintaining tight control over critical operations. Money laundering, covert shipments, and secure communications became central to sustaining his reach. The London gangster, meanwhile, created proxies and intermediaries, allowing his influence to extend across the continent without ever revealing his direct involvement. Both realized that control was not about being everywhere. It was about knowing everything that happened and being able to respond with precision. The stakes had never been higher. Each move carried consequences far beyond immediate neighborhoods, affecting people and operations thousands of miles away. Missteps could mean exposure, law enforcement crackdowns, or violent retaliation. Yet, for both gangsters, the risk was part of the thrill. Every calculated maneuver, every secret alliance, and every silent strike solidified their reputations as figures who could not be underestimated. Their influence now crossed oceans, demonstrating that criminal empires were not bound by geography, but by vision, strategy, and the capacity to manipulate circumstances from the shadows. By the end of this phase, both had reached a pivotal point. They were no longer just city-based crime bosses. They were international players, capable of shaping markets, manipulating rivals, and outsmarting authorities on both sides of the Atlantic. The convergence of their worlds was subtle but unstoppable, and the foundations for a clash or an alliance were quietly being laid, setting the stage for a story that would challenge law enforcement and the underworld alike. By this stage, both gangsters had become masters not just of territory, but of the human mind. Power alone no longer guaranteed obedience. Fear, manipulation, and perception were equally essential tools. In Chicago, the young man orchestrated public displays of control that left the streets trembling. A single arrest, staged in plain view, could signal the consequences of betrayal. A rival's property might be destroyed overnight, leaving no trace of the perpetrator, yet sending a message that could echo through neighborhoods for months. Every act was deliberate, calculated to instill unease, ensuring that people thought twice before challenging him. The psychology of intimidation became as important as the violence itself, and he studied reactions closely, adjusting his methods with precision. In London, the counterpart relied on subtler forms of influence. He orchestrated events that seemed almost random. A body discovered in a deserted alley, a series of businesses suddenly paying fees they could not refuse, or a carefully leaked rumor that destabilized the rival gang. Fear worked silently here. It didn't need witnesses to spread. Those who survived his tactics spread the cautionary tales, amplifying his power without direct confrontation. Control was maintained through careful planning, observation, and an intimate understanding of human behavior. He knew that terror could be both visible and invisible, and he wielded both forms with equal skill. Both gangsters recognized that loyalty could not be taken for granted. Rewards were distributed strategically, creating an atmosphere where devotion was incentivized and betrayal punished ruthlessly. They cultivated networks of enforcers, lieutenants, and informants who were personally invested in their survival and success. The careful balance of fear and reward ensured that those within their empires acted as extensions of their will, carrying out orders with precision and reporting back every detail that mattered. In this way, their reach extended far beyond what a single person could manage, creating systems where influence flowed invisibly through layers of carefully managed hierarchy. Yet with power came paranoia. Both leaders understood that the higher they climbed, the more dangerous their world became. The Chicago gangster mapped out potential threats from rivals, law enforcement, and even his own associates, preparing contingencies for every conceivable betrayal. The London gangster did the same, creating redundant layers of control and maintaining a network of spies who reported subtle shifts in allegiance. Every conversation, every movement, every unexplained absence became part of a broader strategy, ensuring that he could anticipate danger before it arrived. The psychological games extended beyond their inner circles. Both men understood the value of perception. Newspapers, police reports, and street rumors could be manipulated to exaggerate their reach, making them appear omnipresent and almost untouchable. Each calculated action was designed to create an aura of invincibility, forcing competitors and law enforcement alike to question every step they took. By controlling how they were perceived, they maintained authority without exposing themselves unnecessarily, and fear became a weapon more potent than any firearm. By the end of this phase, both gangsters had mastered an empire of shadows. Their control was as much mental as it was physical, extending into every corner of the streets they dominated. Fear, loyalty, and perception intertwined to create a system that few could penetrate. They had become figures not just of crime, but of legend untouchable, calculating, and ruthlessly efficient. The streets obeyed not only because they feared violence, but because they feared the unseen hand that could strike anywhere, at any time, and with consequences that could not be escaped. No empire, no matter how carefully built, is without weakness. By now, both gangsters had amassed vast networks of loyal followers, intricate supply lines, and financial channels that spanned cities and countries. Yet cracks began to appear within their empires, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore. In Chicago, the young man faced the first signs of internal unrest. One of his trusted lieutenants, tempted by money and opportunity, began feeding information to a rival crew. The betrayal threatened not just his operations, but the delicate balance of fear and loyalty he had cultivated for years. Instead of reacting with reckless violence, he used the leak as a test, identifying weaknesses in both the traitor and the surrounding network. He turned the betrayal into an opportunity, isolating the disloyal and strengthening his hold over those who remained. In London, the challenges were no less complex. A rival alliance sought to exploit a perceived vulnerability within his organization, spreading false rumors and subtly undermining his authority. Some of his enforcers, uneasy with the risks of their work, began questioning orders, creating hesitation that could have escalated into disaster. Yet the British gangster had anticipated such moves. He implemented measures to monitor loyalty, using intermediaries and coded communications to identify dissent. Strategic strikes against those testing boundaries reminded everyone that loyalty was non-negotiable, and that missteps carried consequences far beyond immediate punishment. Both leaders had learned a crucial lesson. Trust was a calculated risk. While fear could enforce obedience, loyalty had to be earned, maintained, and verified constantly. Rewards were not handed out blindly, and punishment was applied with precision, always with the goal of reinforcing control. They understood that the same tactics that built empires could destroy them if applied recklessly or without foresight. Every decision became part of a larger strategy, a way to ensure that their networks remained intact and functional despite internal challenges. The cracks in their empires also forced both gangsters to innovate. In Chicago, the young man began using multiple layers of enforcers, informants, and proxies to insulate himself from direct exposure. Those who might betray him were monitored closely, but without revealing that he knew their intentions, allowing him to act decisively when the moment was right. In London, the gangster created redundant systems for his operations, ensuring that even if one link failed, the empire continued to function smoothly. He relied on intermediaries to shield his identity while maintaining complete control over critical decisions. These internal battles were invisible to outsiders. The public saw only the strength and dominance of two rising figures, unaware of the subtle wars being waged within their ranks. The ability to turn crises into opportunities, to manipulate loyalty, and to anticipate betrayal became a defining characteristic of both men. By the end of this chapter of their lives, both gangsters had emerged stronger, more cautious, and more formidable than ever. The cracks in their empires had tested their intelligence, patience, and ruthlessness. They had transformed potential weaknesses into mechanisms for control, proving that even in a world defined by violence and treachery, survival depended as much on strategy and foresight as it did on strength. Their empires were no longer merely vast, they were resilient, adaptive, and built to endure, even as new threats continued to emerge from both within and beyond. As their empires solidified, both gangsters faced a new challenge: the unseen battle that stretched far beyond their streets and neighborhoods. In Chicago, the young man had built a network so vast that law enforcement struggled to keep up. Surveillance teams, undercover agents, and financial investigators circled closer. Yet every attempt to trace his operations seemed to hit a dead end. He had learned to anticipate moves before they were made, using intermediaries and proxies to ensure that his presence remained invisible. Every shipment, every transaction, and every deal was meticulously planned to leave no trace, forcing authorities to chase shadows and misdirection. The thrill of evasion became part of the game, and the higher the stakes, the sharper his strategies became. Across the Atlantic, the London gangster faced a similar reality. His empire extended across cities, regions, and even into neighboring countries. Each expansion increased the risk of exposure, yet he had perfected the art of operating in the shadows. Proxy operatives carried out high-risk tasks, while he remained insulated from direct involvement. Intelligence gathered from informants, surveillance, and rival activity allowed him to stay several steps ahead of both law enforcement and competitors. Small, seemingly random disruptions in rival operations created chaos that further obscured his influence, ensuring that no one could predict his next move. The global reach of their operations meant that a single misstep could trigger catastrophic consequences. A delayed shipment, a leaked piece of information, or an unguarded associate could unravel months of planning. Both gangsters understood that the game they played was no longer local. It was a high-stakes chess match spanning continents. Each decision required careful calculation, balancing risk against reward, and anticipating moves that could be made by rivals, law enforcement, or even disloyal insiders. Mistakes were not just costly, they could be fatal. Despite the pressure, both men thrived on the tension. The Chicago gangster analyzed patterns, predicted rival strategies, and deployed countermeasures with precision. He created layers of deception, ensuring that anyone attempting to infiltrate his network would encounter only confusion, misinformation, and misdirection. In London, the gangster used similar tactics, manipulating perception to amplify his reputation while keeping the true extent of his power hidden. Fear became a silent weapon, spreading through whispers, rumors, and carefully orchestrated events that left competitors second-guessing their every move. The stakes escalated when a single, untraceable phone call set off a chain reaction that could have exposed both operations. In Chicago, shipments were rerouted, enforcers mobilized, and surveillance teams scrambled to respond. In London, coded messages were intercepted, contingencies activated, and rival factions destabilized. Yet, through foresight, discipline, and ruthless efficiency, both gangsters navigated the crisis without revealing themselves. Their ability to manage chaos, manipulate outcomes, and maintain control under pressure demonstrated why they were considered untouchable. By the end of this phase, it was clear that their battles were no longer fought in the open streets, but in shadows, whispers, and subtle maneuvers across vast distances. Every move carried weight, every action was calculated, and every outcome shaped by intellect as much as by force. The unseen war had become a defining feature of their empires, proving that true power relied not on brute strength alone, but on foresight, strategy, and the ability to remain invisible while controlling the world around them. Their names had become legends, feared and respected, as they continued to outmaneuver everyone who dared to challenge them. Years later, both gangsters had become legends in their respective countries, their names whispered in fear, awe, and caution. In Chicago, the young man's empire had grown beyond the reach of most rivals and the comprehension of law enforcement. His network sprawled across neighborhoods, states, and even into international markets. Yet, despite the wealth, influence, and notoriety, he remained a ghost, rarely seen, almost mythical. Those who had once doubted him had either disappeared, joined his ranks, or learned to fear the consequences of defiance. He had created not just a criminal empire, but a system in which every piece moved according to his design, every action measured, and every threat anticipated. In London, the counterpart's rise mirrored the Americans, though achieved through subtler, almost invisible methods. Businesses paid for protection without ever seeing the enforcer. Rivals collapsed under the weight of silent intimidation. Networks operated seamlessly, and the man himself remained an enigma. To the authorities, he was a phantom. To the underworld, a legend. Fear, loyalty, and perception had become intertwined so deeply that the empire operated almost autonomously, a reflection of his mind more than a collection of people and assets. He had learned that influence could be absolute without a single visible display of brute force. Both men had built mirrored legacies, operating in parallel worlds yet connected by the same principles: strategy, intelligence, and ruthlessness. Their stories were a testament to the power of foresight, the strength of calculated risk, and the art of psychological dominance. They had mastered the delicate balance of fear and loyalty, turning internal threats into mechanisms of control and ensuring that their empires could survive challenges that might have destroyed lesser criminals. Betrayals were neutralized before they could spread, rivals were manipulated or eliminated, and law enforcement remained perpetually one step behind. Yet, despite the legend, both men remained aware of the fragility of power. Every empire carried vulnerabilities, no matter how cleverly concealed. They had learned through years of survival that overconfidence could lead to downfall, that a single mistake could unravel decades of careful planning. Paranoia became a constant companion, and trust was never granted freely. Every alliance, every partnership, and every deal was measured for both benefit and risk, ensuring that their empires remained resilient even in the face of uncertainty. Their influence, however, extended far beyond fear and control. They had reshaped the streets, the underworld, and even the methods of law enforcement in their respective countries. Criminal networks had adapted to their strategies, rival gangs emulated their tactics, and authorities were forced to innovate in response to their ingenuity. In the end, the story of these two gangsters was not merely one of crime, violence, or power. It was a study of the criminal mind itself. It revealed how intelligence, foresight, and psychological manipulation could elevate individuals from obscurity to global notoriety. Though neither faced the full consequences of the law, their influence was absolute, and their empires were a testament to the cold, calculating brilliance that defined the most ruthless figures in the criminal underworld. Their names would forever echo in the dark corners of America and the UK, symbols of strategy, fear, and dominance that few could match and even fewer could survive.